Something just cracked open that the mainstream press is already trying to bury under avalanches of spin and official statements, and if you care about what's really driving American foreign policy right now, the raw mechanics of power, the way Washington actually operates versus the way it says it operates, then you need to sit with what just happened in Mexico, because it tells you everything about where this country is heading, who is making the decisions, and what those decisions are going to cost all of us. 2 CIA officers are dead in Mexico's Golden Triangle, killed alongside 2 Mexican state officials during a nighttime operation that has now exploded into a full-blown diplomatic incident, and the story the government first tried to tell the public, that these were simply embassy staff involved in a routine accident, collapsed within days under the weight of too many leaks, too many anonymous officials, and too much evidence pointing in exactly one direction. This was not routine. Nothing about this is routine. One agent entered Mexico on a tourist permit. The other carried a diplomatic passport. Think about that for a moment. These are not the credentials of people conducting above-board, officially sanctioned, diplomatically transparent operations. These are the documents of people who were operating in the shadows, by design, with deliberate deniability baked into the mission from the very beginning. And here is where the story gets important. Not just because 2 Americans died, not just because Mexico is angry, but because this incident is a window into something much larger, much older, and much more dangerous than a car crash in the mountains of Chihuahua. What you are seeing right now, playing out in real time, is the full machinery of American covert power shifting into a new gear, pointed at a neighbor that shares nearly 2,000 miles of border with the United States, a country whose economy is deeply intertwined with American supply chains, American agriculture, American manufacturing, and yet Washington is now treating it the way it has historically treated countries like Guatemala, Chile, or Iran. That shift should alarm every single American who is paying attention. Let's go back and understand how we got here, because the history matters enormously. Newly declassified JFK files released in 2025 confirmed what researchers had long suspected, that the CIA and the Mexican government had an extraordinarily close, deeply cooperative intelligence relationship during the Cold War, one that included sweeping joint surveillance programs, some of which were actually proposed and initiated by Mexican presidents themselves, not by the CIA. Mexico welcomed American intelligence operations on its soil for decades. The relationship was built on mutual benefit, shared ideology during the Cold War, and a calculated political arrangement between Mexican elites and Washington power brokers. The Mexican government allowed the CIA to run surveillance on Soviet, Cuban, and Eastern Bloc embassies in Mexico City. In exchange, Washington looked the other way on a great many things happening inside Mexico itself. That historical pattern of selective cooperation, selective enforcement, and strategic blindness is the foundation upon which today's crisis is built. Even during the post-2008 Merida Initiative era, when billions in U.S. aid flowed to Mexico for counter-narcotics operations, enforcement was uneven and selective, with certain cartels benefiting indirectly from intelligence leaks or informant deals. A 2014 investigation revealed that U.S. agencies effectively helped the rise of the Sinaloa cartel by focusing on its rivals. Read that again slowly. The United States government, through its intelligence and law enforcement apparatus, contributed to the empowerment of one cartel over others. That is not a conspiracy theory, that is documented history. And it raises the obvious, uncomfortable question about what is happening right now, when the CIA is once again operating inside Mexico, working alongside state-level police forces rather than through federal channels, raiding drug laboratories in remote mountain territory with no formal authorization from the Mexican federal government. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said her government was never informed that CIA agents would be participating in the raid of the clandestine drug lab. Her security cabinet reached out to the U.S. Embassy demanding an explanation. And this is where the diplomatic reality of U.S. Mexico relations in 2026 becomes absolutely fascinating in the most unsettling way. Because Sheinbaum is not a naive leader. She knows the Americans operate in Mexico. She knows this has been happening for decades. As one analyst put it, any Mexican leader is going to express concern when U.S. operatives are discovered in Mexico, even though the fact is they know this happens all the time. The outrage is real, the surprise is partially performative. And that combination, genuine sovereignty violation wrapped in political theater, tells you something profound about the nature of the relationship between a powerful nation and its neighbors. But here is the critical piece that you must not lose sight of. The political theater is becoming harder and harder to maintain because the operational reality is escalating far beyond what the theater can contain. The CIA is reviewing its authorities to use lethal force against drug cartels in Mexico and beyond, as the Trump administration moves to make taking on the cartels a major priority for the intelligence agency. The agency is already flying surveillance drones over Mexican territory, drones that are capable of being armed. The review is examining what kinds of activities the CIA could legally undertake, what liability officers would face if American citizens were accidentally killed, and how to manage the inevitable political blowback when operations go wrong. The fact that lawyers are involved in this review does not make it reassuring. It makes it more concerning because it means the administration is not asking whether to do this, it is asking how to do it with sufficient legal cover. On December 15, 2025, Trump signed an executive order designating illicit fentanyl and its primary chemical precursors as weapons of mass destruction, placing drug trafficking in the same conceptual category as chemical weapons and dramatically widening the federal government's operational toolkit. This is a semantic maneuver with enormous practical consequences. When you classify a substance as a weapon of mass destruction, you open the door to the entire counter-terrorism legal architecture: drone strikes, special forces raids, targeted killings, indefinite detention, bulk surveillance. Everything that was built after September 11 to fight Al-Qaeda can now theoretically be aimed at criminal organizations operating in a neighboring country, and the administration has been explicit that this is the intention. Trump designated 6 Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations in February 2025, a designation that Mexico condemned as threatening to its sovereignty and as potentially providing legal justification for military intervention. Now think about the position this puts Mexico in. You have a neighbor who has just legally classified your major criminal organizations as terrorist groups and weapons of mass destruction-related threats. That neighbor's intelligence agency is now conducting unauthorized operations on your soil. That neighbor's president is publicly saying, multiple times in a single week, that cartels are running your country and that something's going to have to be done. Trump has pressed Mexico to allow joint operations against fentanyl laboratories, including the presence of U.S. Special Forces accompanying Mexican troops, and drone strikes have been discussed, an option that would constitute a direct violation of Mexican sovereignty. Sheinbaum has said no to military presence. She has consistently defended sovereignty. But the Americans are operating on the ground anyway, without authorization, working through state-level officials rather than the federal government, precisely because doing it that way makes it easier to maintain deniability. Sovereignty is not for sale, Sheinbaum has said. Unilateral U.S. action inside Mexico would not only erase the trust rebuilt since the end of the previous administration, but also strengthen the most radical wing of her Morena party, pushing Mexico closer to non-alignment and away from North American institutions. That consequence alone should make Washington pause. If the U.S. pushes Mexico too far, Mexico does not simply become a hostile neighbor. It becomes a country with motivation and leverage to reorient its relationships, potentially toward China, potentially toward other regional powers that have been patiently building influence across Latin America precisely because Washington has been creating resentment and instability for generations. And there is the economic dimension that almost nobody in the mainstream press is talking about with appropriate seriousness. Mexico is the United States' largest trade partner, accounting for around $1 trillion in bilateral trade in 2025. $1 trillion. If a military confrontation or a severe diplomatic rupture caused Mexico to close the border to bilateral trade, the effects on the American economy would be catastrophic and immediate. Supply chains for American automotive manufacturing, agriculture, electronics assembly, all of it runs through Mexico. The very factories that the Trump administration claims to be bringing back to American soil are being built in some cases with components manufactured in Mexico. The interconnection is not just deep, it is structural. You cannot extract it surgically without causing enormous damage. Cartels are not passive targets. They are heavily armed, deeply embedded in local economies, and capable of retaliating asymmetrically. Increased CIA activity risks playing one group against another, intentionally or not, thereby repeating old patterns. Violence may spike rather than decrease, and further civilian casualties become likely. This is the historical lesson that never seems to be learned, or perhaps more accurately, is always deliberately ignored. Because here is the uncomfortable truth about the war on drugs that American officials will never say out loud in public. The war on drugs, as it has been prosecuted in Latin America over the past 5 decades, has never been primarily about stopping drugs from entering the United States. If it were, the strategies employed would look completely different. You would see demand-side interventions at home, treatment programs, economic investment in source communities, prosecution of the American financial institutions that launder cartel money. Instead, what you see consistently is supply-side militarization that destabilizes countries, kills civilians, empowers certain criminal factions over others, and ultimately does nothing to reduce the flow of drugs across the border. Former officials have warned about the risks of retaliation by cartels, some of which maintain a presence inside the United States. Mexican cartels are not merely criminal organizations. They operate as paramilitary entities with deep financial resources, global supply chains, and sophisticated logistical networks that extend into the United States. This is the piece that should be keeping American policymakers awake at night, but which seems to receive almost no serious public discussion. If the United States escalates covert and eventually overt military operations against cartels inside Mexico, the cartels do not simply absorb the pressure, they adapt, they retaliate, and they have the capability and the presence to retaliate inside the United States. This is not speculation. The organizational infrastructure is already here. The financial networks are already embedded in American cities. Destabilizing cartel leadership structures without dismantling the underlying networks historically produces fragmentation, and fragmented criminal organizations tend to become more violent, not less. If or when U.S. intelligence officials eventually fall victim to cartel violence, hawks in and outside of the administration will lobby for kinetic action south of the border, and ironically, even perceived anti-interventionists have argued that strikes against cartels would be a smarter use of military force than war with Iran. That logic, that bombing Mexico is somehow preferable to bombing Iran because it would be less consequential for the global economy, represents perhaps the most dangerously distorted reasoning currently circulating in American foreign policy circles. The adverse effects on Americans of military action in Mexico would be far worse than the effects of distant conflicts precisely because of the physical proximity, the economic integration, the millions of families with ties on both sides of the border, and the certainty that any large-scale violence would drive refugee flows northward on a scale that would dwarf anything seen in recent decades. The incident is also being used by Mexico as a potential bargaining chip in ongoing negotiations related to the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which is set for a formal review in July 2026. Here is where geopolitics becomes almost elegant in its brutality. Every incident, every diplomatic note, every press conference where Sheinbaum expresses outrage is also a negotiating move. The Americans know this, the Mexicans know the Americans know this, and yet the dance continues because both sides are extracting something from it. Mexico gets domestic political legitimacy from standing up to the powerful neighbor. Washington gets the operational reality it wants on the ground while maintaining plausible deniability in diplomatic channels. The losers in this arrangement are the Mexican civilians living in the areas where these operations are conducted, the American families who have lost loved ones to fentanyl, and the broader principle that nations should have the right to self-determination without having their sovereignty quietly hollowed out by a more powerful neighbor acting in its own interest. What the death of these two CIA officers has done, more than anything else, is force this entire machinery of covert intervention into the light in a way that is very difficult to reverse. Two U.S. officials speaking on condition of anonymity confirmed that the CIA has been running clandestine operations in Mexico, working alongside vetted state-level police forces and other agencies. That confirmation, delivered through anonymous leaks to The Intercept, is itself a remarkable act. Someone inside the American intelligence community felt that the public needed to know what was happening, and what they revealed is that the United States has been operating in Mexico without federal Mexican authorization, bypassing the central government entirely to work with state-level authorities, precisely to avoid the oversight and transparency that official federal channels would require. This is the pattern that Americans need to understand when they think about their government's intelligence apparatus. It is not that the CIA goes rogue, it is that the CIA operates precisely as it is designed to operate, with maximum flexibility, minimum accountability, and complete deniability when things go wrong. The system is working exactly as intended. What is changing is the geography and the target. The tools that were built to operate in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, the legal frameworks, the operational practices, the culture of deniability, are now being pointed at the Western Hemisphere with the full backing of a presidential administration that has decided the drug war is the next great national security emergency. As one Latin American history scholar put it, The war on drugs has been used as a way to advance U.S. imperial geopolitical designs in the Western Hemisphere, and it is, at its core, a war against poor people, not against drugs. The question that no one in Washington seems to want to honestly confront is this: what is the actual goal, and is that goal achievable through the means being employed? Destroying the cartels as an objective is analytically incoherent. Much like efforts to uproot the Taliban or Hamas, destroying the cartels is a nebulous and unrealistic goal, for the simple reason that drug trafficking organizations emerge from specific social, economic, and political conditions that military force cannot address. You can kill a cartel leader, you can destroy a drug laboratory in the mountains of Chihuahua, you can fly armed drones over Mexican territory. None of this changes the fact that as long as there is a massive, wealthy market for drugs in the United States, and there will be organizations willing to supply it, and those organizations will be violent, well-funded, and adaptable. The demand side of this equation lives in American cities, American suburbs, American homes, and no number of CIA officers operating in Mexican mountain villages will change that fundamental economic reality. What is actually being built here, under the cover of the drug war, is something that should concern anyone who thinks seriously about American power and its long-term costs. The operational reality may involve greater U.S. pressure on Mexico for commitments in intelligence sharing, joint targeting, and local-level dismantling of cartel infrastructure, a stance that risks deepening Mexico's internal militarization, raising concerns over civil-military balance and human rights, while sidelining police reform and judicial capacity building. In other words, the American approach tends to produce more armed men, fewer functioning institutions, and a security landscape that becomes permanently dependent on American intelligence and support to function. That is not a path to stability, that is a path to permanent dependency and permanent intervention, which is historically exactly the outcome that American foreign policy has preferred in its neighboring countries. The 2 CIA officers who died in that ravine in Chihuahua were doing what they were sent to do. They were following orders, executing a mission, serving their country as they understood that service. That should not be forgotten. But the mission itself, the broader strategic direction that sent them there, without formal authorization, through channels designed to avoid oversight, in a country that has explicitly said it does not want American military and intelligence operatives conducting direct operations on its soil, that mission deserves the most serious, most honest scrutiny that Americans are capable of bringing to it. Because the costs of getting this wrong are not abstract. They are measured in lives, in economic damage, in diplomatic relationships that take generations to repair, and in the moral credibility of a nation that still, however imperfectly, aspires to stand for something more than the raw projection of power into the affairs of its neighbors.